Dust coated the windshield of the rusted 1998 Ford pickup as it rolled down County Road 9. David Hayes tightened his grip on the cracked leather steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron gates looming ahead. The warped metal spelled out Whispering Pines, though the towering trees that once earned the property its name had succumbed to blight over a decade ago. He finally claimed the forgotten farm, securing the deed at a blind county auction just 3 days prior. When his paddle had gone up in the stifling heat of the municipal gymnasium, a heavy, suffocating silence had fallen over the room. Not a single person challenged his opening bid. At the time, David assumed he had simply scored the real estate bargain of a lifetime, now staring at the sagging roof of the front porch and the knee-high dead weeds choking the driveway. That silence felt less like awe and much more like a dire warning. Whispering Pines had belonged to Thomas Abernathy, a reclusive cattle rancher who passed away under highly contested circumstances 2 years ago. Since then, the 70-acre plot had sat untouched, rotting under the sweltering summer sun and freezing winter snows. The locals in the nearby town of Oakhaven treated the property like a quarantine zone. Nobody hopped the fence to hunt. Nobody scavenged the abandoned farming equipment. They simply drove past, eyes locked strictly on the road ahead. David parked the truck near the leaning barn and stepped out into the oppressive afternoon heat. The silence out here was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots against the dry gravel. He walked up the wooden steps of the main house, wincing as the floorboards groaned in protest. Pushing open the unlocked front door, he was immediately hit by the smell of decay, stale dust, and something else. Something metallic and sharp like old copper. The interior was completely trashed. Furniture lay overturned, couch cushions were slashed open, and the drywall was punched through in dozens of places. This was not the natural decay of an abandoned home. Someone had systematically torn the house apart, searching for something. Deciding he needed cleaning supplies and a few heavy-duty padlocks before spending the night, David drove back into Oakhaven. The town was a fading snapshot of mid-century Americana. Faded brick storefronts lined Main Street, anchored by a greasy spoon diner, and a hardware store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the 90s. When David walked into the diner to grab a cup of coffee, the low murmur of conversation instantly died. Dozens of eyes locked onto him. A heavy-set man in a sharply tailored but outdated gray suit stood up from a corner booth and approached. He wore a heavy gold ring on his right hand and a smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You must be the out-of-towner who bought the old Abernathy place," the man said, extending a meaty hand. "Richard Caldwell. I happen to be the mayor of this fine community." Not. Mike. David shook his hand, keeping his expression entirely neutral. David Hayes. "Well, David, I'll be blunt with you," Mayor Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried easily in the quiet diner. "You bought a lemon. That land is unstable, the soil is completely toxic from decades of illegal dumping, and the foundation of that house is ready to slide into the ravine. The county was just about to seize it for public safety when you swooped in. If you're a smart man, you'll let me buy the deed off you right now for what you paid, plus 10% for your trouble. Pack up and head back to the city." "I appreciate the concern, Mayor," David replied evenly, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. "But I think I'll try my luck. I've always enjoyed a good renovation project." Caldwell's fake smile vanished, replaced by a mask of barely contained fury. He leaned in closer, invading David's personal space. Thomas Abernathy was a stubborn man, too. He thought he could stand in the way of progress. Now he's resting in a cheap pine box. "Accidents happen out in the country, Mr. Hayes. Emergency services take a very long time to reach Whispering Pines." Caldwell turned and walked out of the diner, leaving a heavy tension in his wake. Sitting a few stools down, Sheriff Bill Brody, a tall, lean man with a face like weathered leather, tipped his hat at David, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. The threat was not veiled, it was a promise. Returning to the farm just as the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt a profound sense of isolation. He locked the newly purchased deadbolts on the front and back doors and set up a camping lantern in the living room. The mayor's desperation confirmed what David had suspected all along. This wasn't about toxic soil or a collapsing foundation. The town's leadership was terrified of this property. They hadn't bid on it themselves because federal auction laws required a strict financial audit of the buyer, something Mayor Caldwell clearly wanted to avoid. Armed with a heavy crowbar and a high-powered flashlight, David began a methodical search of the house. He ignored the obvious hiding spots, the slashed mattresses and broken cabinets that the previous intruders had already destroyed. Instead, he focused on the architecture. Thomas Abernathy was a paranoid man, but he was also a master carpenter. Around midnight, David found himself in the root cellar. The air down here was frigid, smelling of damp earth and old potatoes. He tapped the thick stone walls with the handle of his crowbar, listening to the solid thud against the rock. Then he moved to the floor. The cellar was paved with uneven cobblestones. As he scraped away years of accumulated dirt, he noticed a subtle pattern. 4 stones in the far corner were perfectly flush, lacking the messy mortar that bound the rest of the floor together. Wedging the flat end of the crowbar into the microscopic seam, David put his entire body weight into it. With a harsh scraping sound, the square block of stones popped loose, revealing a hollow cavity underneath. Resting inside the dusty recess was a heavy, military-grade steel lockbox. David hauled it out, breaking the rusted padlock with 2 heavy swings of the crowbar. He threw open the lid, expecting to find old cash or maybe family heirlooms. Instead, he found documents, dozens of perfectly preserved ledger books, bank statements, and encrypted data drives. He pulled out the topmost ledger and opened it under the harsh beam of his flashlight. It took him less than 10 minutes of reading to understand exactly why Thomas Abernathy had been killed, and why the town of Oak Haven was so desperate to keep people away from the farm. This wasn't a rural farming community, it was a massive, highly coordinated money-laundering hub. The ledgers meticulously detailed how Mayor Caldwell, working in tandem with Sheriff Brody, had been funneling millions of dollars from an illicit interstate drug syndicate through the town's municipal development funds. They used fake public works projects to wash the dirty money, turning illegal cash into clean municipal bonds. Abernathy, who had served on the town council, had discovered the discrepancy. He had spent his final years secretly compiling an airtight paper trail, hiding it away in the only place he knew they wouldn't find it. Before Abernathy could take the evidence to the state authorities, he suffered a fatal, accidental tractor rollover. Headlights suddenly washed across the high windows of the living room above. David froze. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway was followed by the slamming of multiple car doors. He quickly shoved the ledgers back into the steel box, turned off his flashlight, and crept up the cellar stairs. Looking through a crack in the front blinds, he saw 3 Oak Haven Sheriff's Department cruisers parked haphazardly on his lawn. Sheriff Brody stood on the porch, flanked by 4 heavily armed deputies. They weren't here to talk. They were here to ensure the new owner of Whispering Pines met the exact same tragic fate as the old one. "Hayes!" Sheriff Brody bellowed, slamming his fist against the newly installed deadbolt. "Open this door. We received a report of a disturbance. Open up, or we're coming in by force." David didn't panic. He walked over to the camping lantern, turned it up to its brightest setting, and calmly unlocked the door, swinging it open. Sheriff Brody stepped inside, resting his hand on his holster, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. His deputies fanned out, their hands resting on their sidearms. Mayor Caldwell walked in right behind them, looking incredibly smug. "Well, David," Caldwell said, looking around the dilapidated room, "it looks like you've had a break-in. It's a shame. Crime is just getting out of control in these rural areas. Sometimes a homeowner gets caught in the crossfire." "I told you this morning, Mayor," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I enjoy a good renovation project. Taking out the trash is just step one, Brody laughed, pulling his weapon from its holster. You've got a lot of nerve, boy. But nerve doesn't stop a bullet. We know you found it. We can smell the fresh dirt on your boots. Hand over Abernathy's box, and we might just make this quick. You assume I'm just a random buyer who got lucky, David said, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't look at the guns pointed at him. He looked straight into Caldwell's eyes. You assume my paddle going up at that auction was a coincidence. Caldwell's smile faltered slightly. What are you talking about? Thomas Abernathy wasn't just a paranoid farmer, David continued, taking a slow step forward. He was my father's older brother, my uncle, and 3 days before his tractor supposedly rolled over, he mailed a certified letter to his favorite nephew. A nephew who happens to be a senior forensic auditor for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The color completely drained from Mayor Caldwell's face. Sheriff Brody tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes darting toward the windows. You've been under a federal microscope for 6 months, Richard, David said, the hammer of absolute justice finally dropping on the corrupt politician. We knew about the shell companies. We knew about the fake municipal bonds. What we didn't have was the physical ledger tying the syndicate's cash to your signature. So, I bought the farm. I came out here to find what my uncle hid, and I found it about 10 minutes ago. Shoot him, Caldwell screamed, stepping backward toward the door. Brody, shoot him right now. I wouldn't do that, Bill, David warned, his voice cutting through the panic like a knife. Look out the window. Brody hesitated, glancing through the cracked blinds. Beyond the tree line, the darkness was suddenly shattered by a massive wall of flashing red and blue lights. The low hum of heavy engines vibrated the floorboards. It wasn't the local sheriff's department. A convoy of black armored SUVs belonging to the Department of Justice had silently surrounded the entire property, cutting off the single road leading back to town. They've been sitting 2 miles down the road all evening, David explained, watching the utter despair wash over the corrupt men in front of him. Waiting for my signal. When you crossed the property line with drawn weapons, you just added attempted murder of a federal agent to your RICO charges. The front door burst open. Heavily armed federal agents flooded the living room, their tactical rifles raised and locked onto the deputies. Brody dropped his weapon instantly, his hands trembling as he raised them in the air. Mayor Caldwell collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his total destruction finally set in. David walked past them, stepped out onto the sagging front porch, and took a deep breath of the cool night air. The corruption that had poisoned this land for years was finally being dragged out into the light. Whispering Pines was no longer a monument to fear and intimidation. It was a testament to hard karma. It would take a lot of work to rebuild the farmhouse, to clear the dead woods, and to bring life back to the soil. But as he watched Caldwell and Brody being shoved into the back of a federal transport van in handcuffs, David knew he was finally ready to start planting.